The Joe Rogan Experience.
What kind of a timeline are we talking about? Like, how long are these studies?
Well, it's going to be about 3 years for the project in Israel. I mean, it's going to be about 160 people.
What about the projects here?
The project at the Portland, Oregon VA is going to be done pretty soon, but it's really just been 4 or 5 cohorts. It's very small numbers of people, and so there will need to be more. I think that there's been some efforts to do what people call in some ways a modified version of individual versus group, is that they've done some of this at Sunstone also, where there'll be 4 people getting psilocybin at the same time, but each in a separate room, each with one therapist. But then near the end of the session, they bring them together, and then they talk about what happened, and then they also have the group integration. So it's kind of a modified. So I think in terms of time frame, it's probably 4 or 5 years before FDA will approve group therapy, maybe longer. The other issue is that the last time that we spoke, it was before the FDA advisory committee and before the FDA meeting to decide whether to approve MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And the advisory committee recommended against it, and the FDA voted against it. This was August of last year. And so that was heartbreaking because I thought that the data really did justify approval, and it did demonstrate safety and efficacy. But there was enough doubts that were raised. One of the big problems to do research with psychedelics is how do you do a double-blind study?
Right.
You know, when you take a powerful drug, you know you've taken it. And if you give an inactive placebo, people can tell the difference. A lot of my dissertation, which I did in 2001, was how to do a double-blind study with psychedelics, particularly with MDMA. And my solution, which made sense, was to do therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. So everybody knows they're getting MDMA. They all have the same expectations. And they might not be aware, though, which dose. You know, is it a full dose? Is it a lower dose? So the challenge was to pick the low dose so that it's high enough to cause a certain amount of confusion, but not so high that it has so much therapeutic potential that you can't tell a difference between the groups. So for 16 years, from 2000 to 2016, MAPS did a series of what are called phase 2 studies to try to figure out how to do phase 3. And we looked at therapy with no MDMA, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40, 50, 75, 100, 125, and 150. So it's sort of like a dose response. We did all these different doses. And what we discovered, fortunately after I'd got my PhD, was that my theory was partially right and partially wrong. That, a microdose of anything is not going to be very good as a placebo because you'll be able to tell. So what was surprising to us was that the lower doses, 25, 30, 40, 50 milligrams, did indeed cause a certain amount of confusion. But when you're working with PTSD patients and you get this activation from the drug, but you don't have enough of the fear reduction, it made people uncomfortable. So we showed that the people that got therapy with no MDMA did better than the people that got therapy with the low doses of MDMA. They still got better, but they didn't get as much benefit. So the analogy is you're taking off in an airplane and there's all this turbulence at the beginning, and then you get above the clouds and it's smooth sailing. So it's kind of like that with MDMA. But the part that we discovered that was very surprising was we did a study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. And one group got 30 milligrams, one group got 75 milligrams, and one group got 125 milligrams. And in that particular study, it was about 26 people, when you randomize, it doesn't mean that everything's equal. It just means it's random. So the people that had 125 milligrams with PTSD had more depression than the people that had 75 milligrams. But the 75 milligram dose group did better than the 125.
Interesting.
Just slightly better. So what it meant was that the dose that's therapeutically effective was lower than we thought.
Can I stop you for a second?
Yeah, please.
When you said the people that did 125 had more depression,
yeah,
do you mean before the study?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it was chosen that they would get the higher dose because they were suffering more.
Well, no. Again, this is randomization.
Right, but you said that they had more depression
Yeah.
before the therapy.
Well,
So how did you determine that?
well, we evaluate everybody's PTSD symptoms and their depression symptoms. And so just by the randomization, it turned out that those people that were higher on depression ended up more of them in the 125.
Just randomly?
Randomly, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because when you randomize, again, it doesn't mean that you're making things equal.
Right.
So it was just a chance.
Just turned out that way.
Turned out that
How many
way.
people were in this group?
26 people were
Okay.
in the entire study.
Okay, so it was
So-
just dumb luck.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it meant to us that this dose of 75 was indeed more therapeutic than we anticipated. So there was no real sweet spot where there was a dose of MDMA that didn't either make people uncomfortable and reduce the effectiveness compared to therapy with no MDMA, or it tipped over into being very effective. So when in November 29th, 2016, when the FDA had what we call the end of phase 2 meeting, after we got approved to go to phase 3, the final studies where you need to prove safety and efficacy, I knew that we shouldn't do that because of this. We shouldn't go directly to phase 3. The FDA offers this opportunity that most pharma companies don't take called special protocol assessment. And you negotiate every aspect of the phase 3 design with FDA. And it can take, for us, it took 8 months. And so pharma companies are thinking there's nothing unusual what I'm doing. My patent life is expiring. But I knew we needed to do that to discuss how to deal with the double blind. And so we presented this information to the FDA. We said, we will give you blinding if you want with these lower doses, but it's going to make our job easier to find a difference between the full dose and these lower doses because it's going to compromise the therapy as compared to therapy with no MDMA at all. And so we said to the FDA, you tell us what you want. And the FDA chose therapy with inactive placebo to make our job harder, which made sense to me. And they said that there's 2 things that you can do to reduce experimenter bias, because the whole purpose of the double blind is to sort of reduce bias, that you don't know what's going on and everybody just treats everybody the same. They said the first is this random assignment. What that means is everybody's similarly motivated and they will work, and the therapists don't know necessarily that. So you do this random assignment. But then the second thing is that you can't have the therapist or the patients rate themselves on how well they've done compared to baseline. You need independent raters that are blind to the condition that the person that they're evaluating is in.
Okay.
So the raters don't know, did this person get the placebo? Did this person get the MDMA? It's
Just don't look at their pupils.
well, well, this is afterwards, but
Okay.
that's right. And it's done on telemedicine. It's done on Zoom. And
okay.
it's an hour-long interview. And it's with what's called the CAPS, the Clinician-Administered PTSD Scale.
And do they have a series of questions?
Yeah. It's like an hour-long interview about their symptoms related to what they call the index trauma, which is the worst thing that ever happened. You pick this is my index trauma, and how do you respond? So we had these independent raters, and then we had this random assignment, and that's what the FDA said is how we should do the phase 3 studies. What was problematic for us was the people at the FDA that we negotiated this with in 2017 then left the FDA. And then new, more conservative people came in at the Division of Psychiatry. And they were more concerned about this, what they called functional unblinding. And that became an issue at the FDA Advisory Committee meeting and at the FDA when they reviewed whether to approve MDMA-assisted therapy or not. And so the pharma company, Lykos, did not really proactively explain to the advisory committee how this design was developed, why FDA chose this design. And so the people in the advisory committee are often more academics, and they're more focused on this double-blind issue, but they're not practical in a sense. So that the FDA realizes that the double-blind fails in practice a lot. It's a theory of how you want to do things. It's something to strive for, but it doesn't work a lot of the times. Even with SSRIs, you think that Prozac or various drugs that you take that are not psychedelic, that those are easy to double-blind. But they're not, because when people have sexual side effects, they have other side effects, and they report to their therapist what's going on, then they can tell from the side effect profile So the double blind fails in practice a lot. But the FDA is saying we can't just only approve drugs where the double blind is perfect. We have to weigh these different things. So that was one of the big issues that the FDA Advisory Committee objected to, was this functional unblinding. So when you asked about the time frame, there was other issues, but where we're at right now is that there's going to be negotiations between Lykos and the FDA, with the new FDA, with the new people at HHS, and there's the proverbial fork in the road. There's either the FDA will say, we believe your data enough that you're not going to need to do another phase 3 study. They might require what's called a phase 4 study, which is after approval, you gather information about safety, about durability, different things. And if that's the case, it's possible that within 6 months the FDA could say yes to approving MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. If the FDA says we want another phase 3 study, that could delay approval for another 3.5 years or so. And that's just on an individual basis.
Wow.
So talk about frustration.
Yeah.
I mean, we had incredible outcomes. So the 2 phase 3 studies that were done, the first one was severe PTSD. And what we showed is that 2/3 of the people that had severe PTSD no longer had PTSD after the treatment, which was 42 hours of therapy, 3 MDMA sessions, 1 month apart, 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions. 2/3 no longer had PTSD that got therapy plus MDMA. And those people that got therapy without MDMA, with the inactive placebo, roughly 1/3 no longer had PTSD. And then another roughly 20% had what's called clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms. Means that their life has changed, their symptoms are not as burdensome, but they still have PTSD. So they're called responders. So we had 88% responders, only 12% non-responders.
Wow.
It's the
That's pretty
best treatment.
extraordinary.
In the second phase 3 study, we purposely moved it to moderate to severe PTSD because we didn't want the FDA to say it's only for severe PTSD. 3/4 of the people did have severe PTSD, and 1/4 had moderate PTSD, and it was 72.6% no longer had PTSD. Almost 3/4 no longer had PTSD at this 2-month follow-up. And what was even more remarkable, and this relates, I think, to the concerns that was expressed about bias and functional unblinding, is that 46% of the people that had therapy with no MDMA also went below the threshold of having a PTSD diagnosis. That's better than any of the other therapies for PTSD. And so what that demonstrated is that the therapist, even though most of them could tell the difference between whether somebody had MDMA or not, that they tried just as hard as they could to help people, whether they got the MDMA or not, and we got extraordinary results in the control group. And I think one of the things that is the explanation is that when you have an 8-hour therapy session with music, with headphones, with more or less half the time people are inside having these different feelings, and the other half they're talking to the therapist in no particular order, you're not forced to focus on the therapy the way with prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy. That's what I said was re-traumatizing. In the studies that the VA did, roughly half the people dropped out. We had very low dropout rates because people are encouraged to we support whatever's emerging. That's the essence of the therapeutic approach that has been developed to support people when they're going through MDMA therapy. And it's very similar to what can be done with psilocybin or LSD or even ibogaine, that you just support whatever's emerging. You have this sense that there's a wisdom of the unconscious. We all know that our body has a certain wisdom in that it moves towards wholeness. We get cuts, it heals. It's below our level of awareness. So there's some kind of wisdom to what's emerging. You could think about it as this barrier, this permeable barrier, semi-permeable barrier between the conscious and the unconscious. And it all happens, we all know, at dreams, that material rises to our awareness at dreams. And it's like that with psychedelics. And so we just support whatever's emerging, and people can go to some happy memories or to layers of trauma, whatever. They're not forced to just focus on the trauma. So we have very low dropout rates. But the people that got the therapy without MDMA were able to make incredible progress.